Hey guys, today we are going to talk about DNA. All right. So before we get into all the ins and outs of what DNA looks like and all of that, let's talk about what DNA is. So this is our cell, remember from way, way back, and our nucleus. And remember that we said that the nucleus was the brains of the cell because it contained our genetic information and information that was converted into proteins and basically controlled everything in our body. We said that at the beginning. Okay. Inside the nucleus, remember we have these things, not exactly X's, but these things that we get, one copy from mom and one copy from dad. These are chromosomes, remember? All right, so let's take this chromosome and we're going to zoom in on the chromosome. Now, this chromosome is tightly packed. It's going to be like this, okay? And we remember our centromere, which doesn't matter right now. Let's zoom in on this tightly coiled part. We're going to zoom in even closer, and we're going to see that we have this double helix, and it's going to be wrapped around these little box called histones. And the only thing that you need to know about histones is that DNA is wrapped around it. So now the histones have to let go eventually of the DNA so that we can turn that DNA into proteins and control the cell and control the body and the organism, okay? So that's all you have to know about histones. What I'm interested in here is the actual DNA. All right, so this is going to be a blow up of DNA. So DNA is what we call a double helix. And this is hard for me to draw, but this just means that there are two strands that twist around one another. Okay, two strands that twist around one another. So now I am going to really blow up this DNA, and I want to see at the very basis level, hold on, at the very tiniest piece, this little tiny piece, I'm going to blow up over here. What is it made of? DNA is made up of, and I'm going to draw three different things here. The first thing is going to be a sugar. That should look like a stop sign, but every single time I draw it looks like a house. Now, remember, sugars are made of carbon. This is a 5-carbon sugar. And this will become important later, by the way, so that's why I'm telling you now. All right. We also have a phosphate over here. And then we have a nitrogen base. And this is where DNA gets its name. because the sugar has 5 carbons, which I promised you would be important later, but it also has only 2 oxygen. There's another oxygen over here. Because of that, we say that it is deoxy. D means without. This oxy means oxygen. So it's deoxy ribo because of the ribose sugar. Nucleic acid. All right. So it is a sugar, a particular ribose sugar. This sugar, I should have put ribose, R-I-B-O-S-E. I'm sorry, I squished it. Ribose sugar without an oxygen. And that's how it gets its name. And that's going to become important later when we learn about RNA. Okay. So we have a phosphate. We have that connected to the sugar here, oxygen here. And I'm going to take these carbons. Well, no, we'll leave it there. It's fine. And then this is the nitrogen base. Now, the nitrogen base comes in 3 types. Whoops, just kidding, 4 types. Adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. Now, there is a rule about these guys. These guys have their own rule. And the rule is called Chargaff's rule because of the guy Chargaff that came up with it. And he discovered that A always goes with T, or adenine always is connected to a thymine, and a guanine is always connected to a cytosine. Okay? So I always say A always goes with T. G always goes with C. All right? And that's just because adenine and guanine are shaped very similarly. And thymine and cytosine are shaped very similarly. And they match together really well. Now, they are going to basically form the rungs of the DNA ladder. So, we know what DNA looks like at the very, very tiniest level. And we know what it looks like in the larger level. We know it looks like a double helix. So let's pretend that I took this and I'm going to straighten it out like this into like a ladder like this. Okay? Because it's hard for me to show you everything if I leave it all curled like that. So I'm going to basically, all I did was just sort of untwist it for now so that I could show you what was on the inside. So I'm making these 2 ladders. I've kind of flattened it out. And so now I'm going to show you how DNA kind of goes together in the line. So the rungs of the ladder are each side. These are the sides of the DNA, or the rungs of the ladder, sides of DNA, whatever you want to call it. All right. So first of all, you know that we have our sugars. So we're going to have our sugar here. And then you know we have our phosphates sticking out of all of them like this, right? And so it just goes down the line. Sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, and so on. Okay? Now, the same thing is happening down each side. Okay, so don't be confused. The same thing is happening. Sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate. The whole situation, just like that on either side. Okay? Now, this bond right here is called phosphodiester bond. Phospho meaning phosphorus, and diester has to do with the chemical composition. All right, now I didn't forget about our friends, the nitrogen bases. We got those guys hanging out here like this. Okay, now they're attached to each other by a hydrogen bond, which, if you remember from way back in the day when we first met each other many, many months ago and we did chemistry, you're going to remember that this is a weak bond between hydrogen atoms. And it's very common in water. And so we kind of talked about that. All right, so now I can put A goes with, oh, you can't see that. Oh my goodness. Instead of the boxes, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put the letters. So A always goes with T. I'll put the dots here. C always goes with G. A, or I can put a T over here, goes with A over here, and so forth. So now, this is what it looks like when it's completely untwisted. Now remember up here where I drew these carbons in and it didn't seem to make sense in the moment? Well, each one of these carbons actually has a number, all right? And the carbons go from, this is carbon number 1, this is carbon number 2. Here, let me delete the carbons. And I'm going to give them all numbers, all right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, okay? Now, this 5, the top little carbon up there, that's what the phosphate bonds to, okay? And we call that the 5' end, okay? So right here is the 5' end. Now, the other side of the DNA is what we call complementary. Because complementary strands, because they are not exact copies of each other. As you can see, this side has A and this side has T. They also have their 5' carbons at the opposite ends. So for instance, Here, the 5' carbon is going to be here. All right. And this is not important right this second, but the reason that I'm telling you this is that eventually we are going to take this DNA and we have to replicate it. And we can only do that from the 5' to the 3' direction. So in other words, in the direction from this carbon to this carbon. Okay. So I am only telling you this right now because it's going to be important tomorrow when we do DNA replication. Okay. So complementary strands, that's either side of these, and they basically run opposite to each other, if you want to think of it that way. So I'm just going to show you a little video from the Amoeba Sisters that explains all of these things.
Spike has traits. The patterns on his body, his size, these traits are coded for in his DNA. Some of the traits he inherited can be influenced by the environment. For example, if Spike had not had the nourishment he needed, that could affect his size. DNA is not just one big code buried deep down in an organism like some treasure. Spike's DNA is in the nuclei of nearly all of his body cells. He inherited his DNA from his mother and father. I can't know for sure what Spike's parents look like, but I do know that Spike inherited his DNA from them. One fun fact, many snake species can reproduce asexually. Had that been the case for Spike, he would have inherited all of his DNA from only one parent. But it would still be DNA coding for traits. Just like Spike, your DNA codes for your traits, and your cells can't function without it. DNA determines how tall you are, what color your eyes are, what color your hair is, or even if you're at risk for certain diseases. Also, like Spike, your entire DNA code is in most of your body cells. That's why in those crime-solving shows, which we may or may not absolutely love, a criminal can sometimes be caught by just leaving a cell from a hair follicle behind. DNA has a beautiful structure, and that structure will help you understand how inheritance works. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a type of nucleic acid. If you remember from our biomolecules video, nucleic acids are a type of biomolecule. Nucleic acids are made up of building blocks called nucleotides. Nucleotides have 3 parts. One of them is a sugar called deoxyribose. One of them is a phosphate. We sometimes say DNA has a sugar-phosphate backbone. But the most important part of the nucleotide is the base, because the sequence of the bases can actually code for traits. So as far as the bases go, there are 4 types of bases in DNA. A lot of times they'll just use the letters A, T, C, G. The A is for adenine, the T is for thymine, the C is for cytosine, and the G is for guanine. These bases actually pair in a specific way, and there's a popular mnemonic that can help you remember which of them pair together. Apples in the tree? That tells you the A for apples, T for tree, because the bases A and T go together. The other verse is car in the garage, and that can help you remember the base C always goes with the base G. Regardless of whether we're talking about Spike, or a plant, or a protist, or a human like you, these are the DNA bases in living organisms. But the amount of DNA bases overall, and the sequence of those bases we mentioned, will vary among different species, and also among different individuals. But it's likely to infer that Spike has a sequence of DNA bases that is more similar to his parents than he would to, say, a rattlesnake. DNA has 2 strands, so there are nucleotides running up one side, and there's nucleotides running up the other side. The bases are what pair in the middle. The bases are held together by hydrogen bonds. The DNA is also twisted in something we call a double helix shape. Portions of DNA make up genes. We can say, for example, that this part of the DNA here makes up a gene. Genes can code for proteins. Proteins have a huge role in expressing a trait. For example, let's consider your own eye color. Human eye color is actually pretty complex. It's determined by many genes. The genes can code for proteins involved in producing the eye color pigment. But proteins coded for by genes, they can play a wide variety of roles besides just your eye color. Proteins are involved in transport, in structure, in acting as enzymes that can make all kinds of materials, in protecting the body, and so much more. We do want to mention that not all genes are used to make protein, and there are parts of DNA that are non-coding. And even though nearly all of your body cells have your entire DNA code, your body cells may only use certain portions of those genes. Genes can be turned on or turned off by a variety of mechanisms. We call that gene regulation. Check out our video on that. Now, you have a lot of DNA. When it's compacted, it can be organized into a unit called a chromosome. Very helpful when you're trying to make more cells and you need to get the DNA into those new cells. Chromosomes in your body involve DNA wrapped around protein structures. Humans have 46 chromosomes. That means nearly every body cell in your body has 46 chromosomes. Human sperm and egg cells, on the other hand, each contain 23 chromosomes. So you receive 23 chromosomes from your mother and 23 chromosomes from your father to give you your 46 chromosomes, your genetic code. So let's do a recap of the big picture. Here's a single chromosome. You see genes on this chromosome. These genes consist of portions of DNA. DNA is made up of nucleotides, and it's these bases here, the sequence of them, that makes the difference in coding for traits. Whew. Understanding this foundation is essential for understanding heredity, whether you're talking about you or Spike.
Okay, so the Amoeba Sisters explained this probably a little bit better than I did, but I just want to go back over the highlights. Number one, chromosomes are basically DNA wrapped around histones, and in the video she said that they were just some proteins. She didn't give you the name of them. I want you to know the name, histones. All right, and then I blew that up and I showed you the double helix, which they showed you, and that double helix each have a nucleotide, which is essentially this sugar with a phosphate and a nitrogen base. The sugar and phosphate and nitrogen base form DNA. The phosphates and the sugar bind together to form a phosphodiester bond. That makes the backbone that she talked about. And then the nitrogen bases pair up in a very orderly fashion. So apple goes in a tree, so A always goes with T, and a car goes in a garage, so C always goes with G. All right, and those are bound together by hydrogen bonds, and we call these complementary strands because they run opposite to each other and are not exact copies of each other. All right, and so tomorrow we are going to replicate DNA, because remember, before we start mitosis or meiosis in any cell, it starts with the S phase, which is replication. So we have to actually replicate this DNA.